What if I told you that Ferrari didn't bring an improvement to Monza, but a completely different car capable of changing the entire season? And that was precisely what left Lewis Hamilton completely shocked. Because while everyone thought that Ferrari was only looking for a few more tenths, they were secretly testing a package that changes up to 50% of the SF26, a desperate, or brilliant, decision that can redefine not only its performance, but also who is really in charge within the team. The question is inevitable. Has Ferrari just found the key to winning again? Or has it just opened the door to a risk that could sink its season? Stay until the end, because what really happened in that private Monza test not only explains why Hamilton was shocked, it explains why this could be the moment that changes absolutely everything. Ferrari arrived at Monza in silence, without cameras, without visible leaks, but with an internal pressure that could not be hidden, because what they were facing was not simply a lack of specific performance, but a structural blockage of the SF26 that had become evident in the first races of the season, where both Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton coincided at the same limit point of the car, an invisible barrier that prevented them from making that definitive leap towards victory and left them constantly trapped on that third step of the podium, a clear sign that the problem was not with the drivers, but with the basis of the car itself. This stagnation had a much deeper impact on Hamilton because his adaptation process was not being linear. He had been dragging very specific difficulties with the behavior of the Ferrari, especially in the way in which the car responded when lifting the accelerator, a characteristic completely opposite to what he had mastered for more than a decade, forcing him to modify habits that he had completely automated, something that in Formula One is not only complex but can make enormous differences in confidence, consistency, and performance in qualifying and the race. That is why Monza was not a casual choice. It was the perfect setting to carry out a completely controlled test, away from the media noise, where Ferrari could validate something much more ambitious than a simple update, because what they took to the track was, in essence, an attempt to reconstruct the behavior of the car from its base, something that is reflected in that brutal data that circulates internally. Up to 50% of the SF26 was modified compared to its previous version, a change that not only affects the pure performance but the way in which the car handles itself. It feels, responds, and adapts to the style of each pilot. This is where the story begins to revolve around Hamilton, because this package does not arrive in a vacuum. It arrives after weeks where the driver himself had publicly exposed his difficulties, where he had recognized that he needed to unlearn his way of driving, and where even Ferrari had had internal problems in its engineering structure at the beginning of the season, which further slowed down that already complex adaptation process. What Ferrari does at Monza, therefore, is not just developing the car. It is responding directly to that diagnosis. It is trying to close the gap between what the SF26 offers and what Hamilton needs to extract its maximum performance, something that, if it works, can completely change the internal dynamics of the team and the balance against Leclerc, because for the first time the car could begin to align with the style of the seven-time champion. But this decision also reveals something even more important. Ferrari understands that it has no margin for error in what is coming, because the compressed calendar and the sprint format in Miami almost completely eliminate the possibility of testing in real conditions, which turns this test in Monza into a kind of dress rehearsal, where every data, every sensation, and every adjustment has to be precise enough to be transferred directly to a race weekend with no room to improvise. And in the midst of all this, what really impresses Hamilton is not only the magnitude of the changes, but what they represent, because Ferrari is not introducing a progressive evolution. It is betting on an aggressive transformation of the car in the middle of the season, something that can turn them into real contenders, or completely destabilize the balance they had built until now. What Ferrari discovers at Monza does not take long to generate an immediate internal reaction, because it is one thing to have an aggressive package, and quite another to understand what it really does when it hits the asphalt. And this is where the real tension begins, because the first indications point to something much deeper than a simple performance improvement. The car no longer behaves like the SF26 they had driven in the first races. This is the exact point where Hamilton enters the scene in a completely different way, because until now his narrative had been one of adaptation, of trying to understand a foreign car, but in Monza he encounters something that breaks that logic, a Ferrari that begins to react differently in critical driving phases, especially in the transition from accelerator to braking. That point where he had suffered the most since his arrival to the team, and which defined a large part of his loss of confidence at the limit. And this is where the impact is real, because when a driver like Hamilton perceives changes in that specific area, he is not just feeling an improvement, he is detecting that the philosophy of the car may be changing, that Ferrari is not only correcting small defects, but trying to reconfigure the way in which the car delivers performance, something that can completely alter its ability to attack corners, manage energy, and, above all, build consistent laps in qualifying. But this type of transformation does not come without consequences, because modifying up to 50% of the car not only opens up new possibilities, it also introduces uncertainty, and within the team a key doubt begins to appear. Is this new Ferrari faster, or simply different? Because in Formula One it is not enough to gain absolute performance, you need that performance to be usable, repeatable, and predictable, especially in conditions of real race pressure. Ferrari, aware of this, uses Monza as an extreme validation environment, not only looking for times but correlation of data, trying to understand if everything they have developed in the simulator and wind tunnel really translates to the track. Something critical when the next step is to take that package directly to a sprint weekend where there will be no room to correct errors on the fly. And in the middle of this process, another factor appears that increases the tension even more. The internal equality between Hamilton and Leclerc, because up to this point both had been practically matched in performance, with minimal differences in classification and similar results in the race, which turns any change in the behavior of the car into a possible turning point in the team's hierarchy. If this new package favors Hamilton's style, if it really corrects those weaknesses that he himself had pointed out, then Ferrari would not only be solving a technical problem, it would be altering the internal balance, giving the Briton a tool that could speed up his adaptation drastically and place him in a completely different position within the team. But at the same time, if the car becomes more demanding, narrower in its operating window, or more difficult to interpret, the effect can be the opposite, generating even more inconsistencies and complicating the lives of both drivers at a time when each point begins to be critical in the championship. What happens at Monza, therefore, is not just a technical test, it is a multi-layered strategic bet where Ferrari is playing with fire because they are trying to make a leap forward in performance, but in doing so they are rewriting the internal rules of their own car, and that is exactly what leaves Hamilton shocked. It is not just that the Ferrari is different, it is that it can become something completely new. What Ferrari unleashes in Monza does not stay on the circuit because the true impact of this test begins to be projected towards what is to come, and that is where everything makes sense because this package was not designed to test. It was designed to compete immediately, in a context where there will be no margin for error, where each decision will have to work the first time, especially with the arrival of Miami and its sprint format that almost completely eliminates the ability to react during the weekend. And this is where the figure of Hamilton becomes the central axis of everything, because if this new Ferrari really corrects those limitations that it had been carrying, if it manages to give him that confidence in the front axle, that stability in the transition, and that predictability in the power delivery that he so needed, then the scenario changes completely, not only for him but for Ferrari as a team, because we would be talking about a driver who is no longer adapting, but attacking. What Monza reveals, ultimately, is that Ferrari is no longer playing to ensure results, it is playing to change its destiny in the season, and that completely redefines the role of its drivers, because both Hamilton and Leclerc stop being simple executors of a limited car and become key pieces in the validation of a new concept, one that has not yet been tested under real pressure. And in the midst of all this, there remains a clear feeling, a kind of before and after, because if this package works, if it really manages to translate what Ferrari saw in Monza to the reality of a Grand Prix, then we will not only be talking about an improvement, we will be talking about the exact moment in which Ferrari rewrites its season and in which Hamilton stops chasing the car to finally start leading it. What Ferrari reveals at Monza is not simply a package of improvements, it is a total break with the version of the SF26 that we saw at the beginning of the season. A clear statement that the team has decided to leave behind any conservative approach to bet on a radical transformation at the most delicate moment of the championship, just when the margin for reaction is practically non-existent and each movement can define the rest of the year. This test, far from being an isolated experiment, becomes the point where all the accumulated tensions converge. A car that had reached its limit, two drivers evenly matched without being able to make the final leap, and a Hamilton who was still in the process of adapting to a car that did not fit his DNA as a driver, a context that forced Ferrari to make an extreme decision: evolve or stay behind. And they chose to evolve, but not in any way but by changing up to 50% of the car, which completely redefines the scenario because we are no longer talking about finding a few tenths, we are talking about rebuilding the behavior of the car, altering its philosophy, and, above all, trying to align it with the needs of a driver who can make a difference if he has the right tools. That is why the impact on Hamilton is so profound, because for the first time he is not facing a Ferrari that he must understand, but one that can begin to understand him, and that difference changes everything because if that connection is consolidated, his adaptation stops being a weakness and becomes a weapon, something that can alter not only his individual performance, but also the internal balance against Leclerc. But at the same time, this bet opens a scenario of maximum uncertainty, because introducing so many changes at once implies enormous risks, from correlation problems to a more critical operating window, which means that Ferrari is not only chasing performance, it is playing directly with the stability of its project in the middle of the season. And there is the real key to all this. Monza does not tell us if Ferrari is already faster. What it tells us is that Ferrari has decided to change the rules of its own game, advancing a revolution that can make them real contenders or further expose their weaknesses if they cannot get everything to click under pressure. The only thing that is clear is this: after Monza, we are no longer seeing the same Ferrari, and Hamilton is not facing the same car either. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.